My mother was there, like, just watching television and that. And I was sitting on the floor, with my back against this tea. All of a sudden, I felt this thing come over me, you know. Just come over my mind and everything.
Had anything upset you particularly?
Not really, no, except for not being able to control myself properly. No self-control.
When you first became...
Well, I mean, I could have control. You know, but I don't see any point in that anymore, you know.
So you used to have control of yourself, but you lost it, and now you don't see any point getting it back?
No, because I can't really get it back anymore.
Some people manage to.
Well, I probably managed to a certain extent, just that the way I feel most of the time is as if I'm in two parts. Do you understand me?
I think so.
That's it.
For most people, schizophrenia is a funny-sounding word to do with people who are mad, suffering from some kind of split personality, rather like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and who are probably dangerous as well. In this film, we're going to do our best to undermine that particular inaccurate and damaging myth, which has played a small but not insignificant part in allowing the rest of us to turn our backs on schizophrenia sufferers and their families, and has helped us to accept a situation where more than 250,000 of our fellow citizens are spending their lives as virtual outcasts from society. We're going to call this little girl Ruth. She was born and brought up in the north of England as a happy, normal little girl. But during her teens, she began to withdraw into herself, and then a few days after her 21st birthday, she suffered her first breakdown.
She was screaming at one point in the loudest way that it was possible for a person to scream. Her eyes were wide open, the mouth was wide open, and this was just sheer terror. It wasn't fear, it was absolute terror.
At one stage I tried to hold her. She ran round the hall, round, and I couldn't get hold of her. And the more I came towards her, the more fearful she was of me. And she was convinced that I was trying to kill the dog. I was sticking knitting needles in the dog, she said, and I was trying to kill the dog. I was going to throw the dog in the boiler. I'd thrown the dog in the boiler. The dog was dead. We had a perfectly all right little miniature dash and nothing wrong with it, but she was convinced all sorts was happening. And so I thought that she was seeing things and hearing things that I didn't know anything about.
She imagined that her bedroom was crawling with 4-foot spiders in the most grotesque dress. The spiders were all about the bedroom. They were crawling all over the bed.
She could see insects crawling all over food.
All over the food, all over drink, and the insects would flow into the mouth along with the drink.
Ruth's first breakdown was in 1979. Despite spending more than a year in hospital, her doctors have been unable to do more than stabilise her condition. On medical advice, she is now living at a seaside boarding house to give both her and her parents a break after almost 6 years of unrelenting stress.
You think all sorts of things. That when she was born, for instance, that you should have got this midwife quicker, or maybe it was something to do with the birth that was your fault, or maybe because you were sick before the baby was born. Maybe that was something to do with it. You can think of all sorts of things that it might have been, and you'll take blame for all sorts of things. You go through the whole life of the person thinking that you might have done damage in some way.
You almost sort of wish there was something else wrong.
Yes, so anything is better than schizophrenia. It's I believe it's the worst thing that could happen to anybody. I've always said that to have both legs amputated would be a simple thing in comparison. You've no idea what you can do to help. You try to help.
We had assistance from my sisters who came down to help. But we realised that something would have to be done in the long term. Therefore, I had to finish work and try to cope with the situation at home, because she was discharged from hospital after several weeks. Then came the process, as we thought, and we regarded it as our duty to aid the process of recovery. And we thought, in our innocence, that we would be able to do this. But it turned out that we couldn't do this. Even combined, we couldn't do it.
Were you staying with her almost 24 hours a day because she was frightened and needed you, or because you were worried about perhaps her damaging herself or doing something?
Both.
Both, really. She would appeal to us to cure the illness, and we couldn't. Sorry.
She still does. She says, she rings up and she says, "What sort of a mother are you that you can't put it right?" She says herself sometimes, "I used to be all right, didn't I? I was all right, wasn't I?" And she needs a lot of convincing of that, and because she always hopes to be back exactly where she was before. Whether she ever will be, I don't know.
Seeing things, hearing voices, and holding strange beliefs are all the result of a breakdown in the process of perception which is caused by schizophrenia. The limited amount of research that's been undertaken has also established that schizophrenia tends to strike during adolescence, and that while 1/3 of its victims will recover, the rest face a lifetime of relapsing into bouts of acute mental confusion. Powerful sedatives can help to lessen or even to eliminate the hallucinations, but often they act only as a sort of chemical straitjacket, leaving the schizophrenic to cope with their other emotional problems. These may include irrational feelings of anxiety or dread, inexplicable periods of depression or elation, and sometimes an almost total withdrawal from the outside world. Matthew Harvey is 24. He's suffered from schizophrenia for the past 8 years. He spends several hours every day practicing on his drums in the hope of emulating his hero, Phil Collins.
He was at college. He'd gone to college just after having left school, and his behaviour started to be very odd. He used to get out of bed at night and wander about in the night and want to sleep in the daytime. And I noticed that his face started changing, that he began to develop an odd look in his eyes, and his lips took on almost like an animal snarl. After a while, he did get better. After a while, but it was pretty rough going until he was better. We had some very aggressive outbursts from him, and a lot of distress, a great deal of harking back to earlier in his teens when his father had left home, and various things were worrying him. But he did get better, and then that was the first time, and then it all blew up again when he was about 19.
And that happened as well, wasn't it? When I was doing the same thing, wasn't I? Getting up, not getting dressed, and think mornings were night and night was day, and
Yes.
vice versa, and things like that.
Yes.
And things like doors were like, I thought that when I saw a door, I thought that it was that when I saw a door that was open, I thought that was a key open to life, you know. And
I didn't know that.
I don't know, or something like that. And the door, when it was closed, it was death was on the end of life. I'm a bit upset while I'm talking actually because it was a bit upsetting, if you see what I mean.
Not remembering back to that time.
We don't actually want to upset you, Matthew, but at the same time...
I know, the whole idea is to... Yeah.
Do you remember you used to pick up knives as well, and he used to pick them up in his hand and hold them and then just turn them against himself? And that worried me a great deal, and I wasn't sure if it was just a cry for help or whether he was really wanting to kill himself.
No, what it was is I felt like killing myself, but I knew I wouldn't do a thing like that until recently when I took some tablets to supply, about 40 tablets, which nearly killed me, didn't it? But I pulled through, and I'm lucky to be here alive today. I'm lucky to be alive today.
Do you remember what you were thinking when you took that overdose, Matthew?
Well, I thought I couldn't stand it any longer. I thought I had to kill myself.
What sort of medication are you on at the moment?
Lithium, pimicide, and prozidine, which is, I think, I should know this, but people have said that it is chemogene, another name for it.
What effects does it have on you?
Well, first of all, it started, I was feeling a bit heavy at times, like I couldn't run, but now as I've been on it, it seems I feel much happier at the moment. Plus the other lithium, the tablet called lithium that I'm on, is a good drug. I mean, it's because I don't think I've got schizophrenia anymore, but I may have obviously bits, but I might not. But I think I've got now more manic depressive in me now, because it's why I'm on lithium, because lithium
is for depression.
Is for up and down when you go too high, too low.
Have you noticed
this one keeps me stable all the time. That's why it's such a good drug.
Have you noticed any effects of the drugs, Anne, on Matthew?
In the past, yes. I think at times he has been very heavy in his body. He's a very thin child and young teenager. And then when he started to go into these drugs, he seemed to develop a large tummy. And when I queried this with the doctor, he said, "Oh, you're obsessed with slim young men," which I now have found out from several psychiatrists who treat schizophrenia that it's a common side effect. He used to have shaking of the hands, but that was righted by another drug. I don't like the idea of the drugs. I don't think anybody likes the idea of a son or daughter being on medication in a permanent way, but
You see, no one likes taking tablets. I mean, I don't like taking tablets. I'm so used to taking tablets now. It's very good that I'm used to it, because otherwise, if I don't, I believe I would be ill.
Because both the symptoms and schizophrenics themselves can be controlled by powerful sedatives, successive governments have been able to discharge tens of thousands of patients from the big old mental hospitals, with their rules, regulations, and their dangers of institutionalisation. Manchester's Prestwich Hospital follows this policy of community care for both its long-term and short-stay patients. Kevin Chesworth has just been discharged after spending a fortnight in the acute admissions ward. He's been in and out of Prestwich on countless occasions since his first schizophrenic breakdown 7 years ago. As is often the case, that first breakdown at 17 followed a domestic crisis.
My marriage broke up at that time. I think he missed his dad quite a lot. He seemed to do anyway. My other daughter went to university that year. Noel got married. And my other son got married the following year. So it meant that there was only Kevin and myself in the house. And he seemed to think that I was putting everybody out of the house. I didn't seem to want anybody in the house.
Do you remember your mum and dad splitting up?
Oh no, don't. Can't stand being reminded of that, really, no. That's one of my problems with it. Caused so much bloody trouble.
But you think that caused the trouble?
No less, yeah.
Is that because somebody else has said that to you, or because you can remember it upsetting you?
Well, Is it because what?
Well, is it, as somebody else said to you, oh, it was probably when your parents split up that you became so upset, or do you remember being upset at the time?
Yeah. Yeah, I just felt as though I was done for, but it's another thing, I can't stand fleas and flies or anything like that. Just cannot stand it at all. And do you know why? Well, inside me here, I'll have in a bath. Say I went to the baths or something like that, and dived in the water or whatever. If the water got me here right, well, it'd seep through into me either body or whatever, and that's why I don't go swimming, you know.
The last time I had him admitted, he was desperately ill for about 2 weeks. He wasn't sleeping all night. He was sleeping in the day. He was walking about all night. He comes to my room to give me cups of tea all night, to try and wake me up. I think he's lonely. And he's seen all sorts of things, you know. Even half the time he doesn't know I'm his mother.
Kevin's relapses often involve him being particularly aggressive towards his mother, who finds it impossible to cope with him. When this happens, Kevin is usually admitted on a compulsory short-stay order to Prestwich's acute admissions ward. While he's here, he receives powerful psychotropic drugs to control his hallucinations. But even when this has been achieved, there's still the problem of where he's going to stay when his consultant psychiatrist, Dr. Michael Tarsh, discharges him.
At one point, my mother actually wouldn't sleep in the house with him because she was so afraid of what he would do. Dr. Tarsh's suggestion that Kevin should just go back home, which would have put us in the same situation where we'd been 12 months before. When I suggested that that was rather a silly thing to do, he said, well, he might as well rot at home as rot in Arnside Ward, which was where he was at the time.
Certainly I suggested that he ought to be out, that he ought to be in some sort of hostile situation, that he wasn't doing well in hospital, and that he wasn't doing well because of very difficult relationships at home either, and he is now in a hostel and on the whole happier because of it.
But a word like rot is, how does that help the relatives to appreciate what's happening to the sufferer?
I don't think it does. Sometimes even psychiatrists can be provoked by often rather unreasonable relatives who do tend to persecute one.
I've only spoke to Dr. Tash once, and he gave me no advice whatsoever. He just told me when I said that I couldn't manage Kevin at home again. And he said, well, if you don't, he can go to Bloom Street. That's the only place for him.
That's the night shelter.
Yeah. And I said I wouldn't let him go there. So I ended up taking him home again.
How do you get on with Dr. Tarsh?
I don't think I get on very well at all with him.
Have they ever said they could make you better?
Well, my mother was there, yeah. See, my mother believes, well, my mother seems to believe anything at all, you know what I mean? So, really, it's just a farce, isn't it? Oh, that's been a farce.
Kevin is a major troublemaker in the ward. He's somebody who, on the whole, does more other patients harm than we do him good.
Then that's his illness rather than Kevin, is it not?
Oh, no, I don't think so. You see, there are plenty of schizophrenics who are antisocial not only because of their illness. You're not exclusively mad. There are plenty of people who are both mad and bad, and Kevin is both. The fact that you suffer from schizophrenic illness doesn't mean to say that you're nice or not manipulative or whatever, or that your family are nice and not manipulative.
What do you think is going to happen to Kevin?
I really don't know, unless something definite is sorted out as far as living arrangements and supervision arrangements are made. Within the next 12 months, I can see Kevin actually getting to a situation where he's more or less in a permanent state of relapse.
So if he cannot manage in the community and you can't have him here, what in your estimation will happen to him?
Well, if he breaks down and becomes floridly disturbed, starts hearing the voices again, then he will come back and will be looked after during a period of florid disturbance. If he causes trouble and gets taken into prison, as with many chronic schizophrenics, he will go there and the situation will be re-evaluated.
Having met people like the Chesworths, they aren't alone in feeling isolated and in feeling that they are not getting the help that they would like. And they don't want to whinge, but those people are suffering.
I agree that they are, and there are alternatives, and they should look for them.
But if the alternatives aren't there?
Well, I think the alternatives are there, in fact.
If you look hard enough?
People find alternatives. Most Kevins are not in hospital unless they are acutely disturbed and hearing things. Most Kevins are outside. If we had all the Kevins in, we would have to have 2 or 3 times as many beds.
James Andrews was a pupil at Haberdasher public school from 1971 to 1974. At the end of the summer term, he was expelled for being uncommunicative and lacking in cooperation. His parents appealed unsuccessfully against that decision. James's quietness and withdrawal were caused by schizophrenia.
I think he was very, very upset. It happened in the last week of the term, and it was really quite a bolt out of the blue, although we knew that he wasn't performing at all well there. But I think to him it was a very great shock indeed, and it was from that time that he really became extremely ill.
Did he suffer from hallucinations?
He did on occasions. He certainly suffered from voices, which worried him dreadfully, because the constant presence of voices in your mind is very disturbing and distressing. He certainly suffered from hallucinations before he had medication.
What form did those hallucinations take?
It's difficult to know because he didn't really talk about them, but it was obvious from the way he behaved that he was moving away from things, or he he spent a great deal of time with his hands over his face, really, just obviously living in some other world, some other realm of thought. Perhaps he would have a day when he would be quite reasonable, and then he would have another day where he would just be sitting at the table and he would put his hand out and push off the pot of plants or flowers or whatever was there, and it might break. I would think that probably there was aggression on most days of that stage, because he was very unhappy and disturbed in himself.
And when you were the subject of his aggression, I mean, can you give me, if not a typical example, I mean, can you say, again, be more specific about what would happen?
Well, he would really hit me very hard as he went past me, and if I spoke to him about it, he'd say, "I only touched you. I didn't do more than just touch you. How could that have hurt you?" He might kick, he might suddenly drop something on someone who was walking by. He certainly threw a milk bottle through the window once. It's difficult to remember, but we did have a lot of breakages, and things like doors he would slam, but not ordinarily slamming. It was a very solid Edwardian house, and yet the door frames were all coming away from the plaster. When I talked to nurses or doctors about him slamming doors in this way, they seemed to think that I was being unduly fussy, but it was totally abnormal strength that he exerted. It wasn't ordinary anger, it was something unfathomable, really. Well, the final thing was when he dropped a large radio from the top floor of our three-storey house, and it nearly hit me. It just grazed the side of my head, and I realised that he would or could do something so dreadful that the result for him, apart from anybody else, would be so appalling. And so I had to just call the police and go through the procedure of police and social worker and psychiatrist. And finally, some hours later, Jamie went to Hill End, to the locked ward.
That must have been a very difficult decision for you to take.
Yes, it was. It was appalling, because he was a young boy, and he was going from his home into a strange environment in which he would be terrified. In fact, when he got there, he jumped through one of the small panes of a glass window. But he was totally unhurt at that stage. Nothing really seemed to harm him.
After a few weeks in the lock-up ward, Jamie should have moved to Hill End's adolescent unit, but the hospital said that at 16 years 3 months, he was just 3 months over the age limit. Instead, he was sent home to his increasingly anxious family.
I think obviously we were all very tense. We were certainly all worried and concerned as to what might happen. I think both my sons managed incredibly well in that they kept their lives going. I had a job which I had to continue. I think it affected my husband most in that he was less able to accept it. And some people just cannot accept this bizarre behaviour.
How did your husband react, in fact?
Well, he felt that Jamie should just be taken away and that would end the problem. But even when he was away in hospital, obviously he needed to be visited, he needed to be reassured, and this was difficult for my husband to accept.
Determined to get help, Peggy Andrews persuaded Hertfordshire's health authority to pay for James to go to an adolescent unit in Northampton. But after 12 months, government cuts meant that the authority felt it could no longer afford the cost of James's treatment.
The head of that hospital was very angry because he said the only people that Hertfordshire would pay for were very difficult geriatric patients who their own nurses wouldn't nurse. And yet here was a young man with his life before him, and they weren't prepared to extend the time.
Were you able to fight or to question that decision at all, or was he?
No, because there was just a blanket sort of front that Hertfordshire would not fund anyone outside their area. There was nothing I could do, although I certainly tried.
For the next 12 months, James stayed at home, steadily withdrawing into himself. Eventually, his mother managed to persuade him to start attending a local authority day centre for the mentally ill. It's one of the only 2 centres run by Hertfordshire Social Services out of their annual budget of £40 million.
To me, it was wonderful that he was managing to go, take quite a long walk to a station, go on the train, have another walk to the day centre, get himself there and get himself home again. But unfortunately, they said he didn't join in, he didn't contribute to the discussions, and he was often late. And after 5 weeks, they sent him home with the social worker and said he can't come anymore.
It wasn't that he was disruptive?
No, he wasn't at all disruptive. He was just too withdrawn, and he wasn't prepared or able. He wasn't able to sit and discuss his problems and to try to talk things through, because that isn't something that at that stage he could possibly do. It showed a total inability to understand his illness and his condition, and I think it was very cruel indeed.
Who actually made that decision? Was it a medically qualified person?
It was the people who ran the day centre. There were a team of them.
They're social services people?
Yes, they were social services people. Quite young, people with theories and ideas about people making progress and getting better, with no knowledge, I would have said at all, of a young chronic schizophrenic sufferer.
He was a very destructive young man, not in as much as he would just tear something up, but he was destructive in his relationships and eventually destructive of himself, in that he refused all kind of eye contact with people. He would withdraw from personal contact, personal relationships. He would actually walk backwards out of a room when people walked into a room. He would have very aggressive outbursts to the staff and to the residents, until eventually the whole of the day centre became affected by James's behaviour. And for the sake of the other people that were attending the day centre, it became necessary to face James with his behaviour and the effect that it was having upon other people. And James, unfortunately, was not the kind of person at that stage who was able to discuss these matters, and a kind of discussion of that kind just led to more aggression, until eventually it was in everybody's interest that James be asked not to continue at the day centre.
I did go and I begged them to let him come back at least for part of the time, because it obviously was something that he ought to be doing, but they just, it was like talking to a brick wall. They'd made their minds up and they weren't prepared to discuss it.
That must have taken quite an effort on your part to go and, in a sense, ask them, beg them to change something.
Yes, in a situation like that, you have to put yourself in a position where you are frankly humiliated, because they didn't make me feel that they had any concern for Jamie. They somehow made me feel that I was a nuisance trying to get help for my son. I didn't feel they had any real sympathy for him as a person. He was just somebody who didn't fit into that little particular system they had going.
And when you spoke to the social worker, did he say that he couldn't do anything more for Jamie because of that decision? Or was that a separate decision?
Because of that decision, he said there was nowhere else he could get Jamie admitted to, and he didn't think there was any more he could do. I think he probably felt that there wasn't much more he could do. He wasn't going to really exert himself anymore.
And no decisions of that kind are made on an individual basis. That would have been discussed with a senior team leader, and the decision would have been made on really 2 counts. First of all, whether or not the contact, which was a voluntary contact with James, was actually proven to be at all beneficial. And secondly, what were the other pressures that were on the demands that were on the team, and whether or not time could have been better spent with other people. Now, of course, so far as James is concerned, and perhaps more particularly his parents, a decision of that kind might seem to be a rather heartless decision. But in relation to the other demands that are upon the staff, and particularly people who are better motivated and more able to use the facilities than James, then they're the kind of decisions that are made in social services on a day-by-day basis.
But you can understand how Mrs. Andrews felt that your department was washing its hands of James's life.
Yes, that's right. But we had by that time, I do want to emphasise, we had by that time had something like 2.5 years of experience of James, in which he had made it very plain that he resented the contact, and he did not respond at all to the efforts of Mr. Boyd or the day centre.
But the fact is, I suppose, is that that was James's illness rather than James himself.
Yes, that's true. That's absolutely true. But of course, if you take the community as a whole, there are a large number of people who, whether ill or disturbed in other ways, we think may need help. But it is for them to decide whether or not they want to accept that help and respond. And sadly, James was never motivated to accept help.
In January 1983, James was committed to a long-stay mental hospital at Knapsbury. Most of the 800 patients here are severely damaged geriatrics.
Knapsbury was always held up as a place that you went to if you didn't make progress, as a punishment, really. It was a spiral, really. The longer he was there, the more disturbed, in a way, he became. And the possibilities of him going to other places were never acted on. The social worker there at Knapsbury only saw my son once, and when I begged her on the phone to see me and to discuss his situation, she said, I can only give you a family appointment in July, which was about 3 months ahead. Months meant, weeks meant nothing to them, but to my son, it meant everything.
On the morning of September the 18th, 1984, James Andrews left his ward and walked a few hundred yards to the nearby railway line.
He had talked about it, and he had tried things in the past, always in situations of great despair. When he went first to Knapsbury and he came home, he jumped from the top floor window of our house, and he was quite badly injured. It was because he didn't want to go back to Knapsbury. And saying this to you, it must sound, why on earth didn't you have him home? But it just wasn't possible.
No, it doesn't sound like that, Mrs. Andrews, honestly. It sounds like a nightmare into something that has been going on a long time. I don't really think you should feel that at all. It doesn't sound like that to me.
It just is impossible to assimilate into a small home somebody like Jamie, and yet with the right support he could have led a perfectly happy life. He would have had his home to visit and all the support from his family. There was nobody, and there still is nobody in the system who really cares about these youngsters or about older people. They sit on committees, they talk about things, they have meetings, and the life of that person is going on in between. It just is very cruel.
The coroner's inquest returned an open verdict on Jamie Andrews' death. This sort of reluctance to return a verdict of suicide is not an isolated case and may reflect a desire to spare parents from further suffering. One obvious result of this is that nobody really knows how many schizophrenics are taking their own lives, either because of the hopelessness of their situation in hospital or because they find it impossible to cope after they've been discharged and sent back to their families or been dumped in down-market bed and breakfast hotels, night shelters or Salvation Army hostels. A recently completed 5-year study of patients discharged from a large mental hospital in North London found that less than 5% were living in any kind of sheltered accommodation, that very few of them had seen a psychiatrist since leaving hospital, and that contacts with either GPs or social workers were almost non-existent. In these circumstances, it's not really surprising that the only available estimate suggests that 1 in 10 schizophrenics will commit suicide, which means that they are 1,000 times more likely to kill themselves than you or I. The Northwest Fellowship, a self-help group based in Warrington, was formed just over 4 years ago to provide residential and daytime facilities for the mentally ill. Its director, David Lyne, has also been monitoring the number of suicides amongst the 100 members of the fellowship who suffer from schizophrenia.
Within the last year, the number of suicides that have occurred, not suicide attempts, but the number of suicides that have occurred have been 15. 9 of those people have committed suicide by walking in front of a train or by putting their head on the railway line. One of those suicides was somebody who jumped from a motorway bridge. People have hung themselves and taken drugs. And I think that that needs to be recognised. It seems to me that the risk of suicide always seems to be minimised. The risk of suicide is something that families have to live with. It's something that agencies providing community care will have to live with as well.
Do you think that that figure of 15 is sort of represents an increase, or is there actually no way of telling?
There's no way of telling that. I actually think that more research should be done into the incidence of suicide amongst people suffering from schizophrenia. It seems to me to be not something that's in normal experience to know of that number of people who've taken their lives in such a dramatic way. I think to actually take the step of putting yourself in front of a train is fairly irrevocable.
Attempted suicides?
Attempted suicide, almost too frequent to be able to list or even to remember. Suicide where people drug overdose, where they lacerate their wrists. One young girl I know who believed that her blood was infected by something that she called Black Jack. In trying to get Black Jack out of her blood, she cut herself from her throat to her navel with a knife. She has lacerated her arms. She is badly in need of help, and she gets help intermittently. I suppose that there was the problem that at some time or other she may be successful in killing herself.
It was quite clear, I think, that eventually he would kill himself. He used to discuss this. It sounds absolutely a surrealist situation, but he used to say that he would not continue to live with this illness, which nobody could do anything about, because he'd read all about it. And he just wasn't intending to carry on when he'd tried everything, as it were, and he knew there was nothing more that anybody could really do to help him.
What did you say when he said things like that?
Sounds balmy, but I mean, I used to say things to him like, well, for goodness sake, don't throw yourself off a motorway bridge, because remember there are motorists and you might ruin the life of the poor motorist. You know, it sounds balmy and you may think that, what a callous woman to say that sort of thing. But until you've been in this situation, you can't describe what it's like.
A few months after this photo was taken, Ben Hefford threw himself in front of the London to Glasgow Express as it travelled through his hometown of Carlisle. He was just 22 years old.
I wasn't surprised because I knew that he would kill himself, and it was only a matter of time. I wasn't surprised to see police cars outside the flat. And when I went in there, the drug squad were tearing the place to pieces, and one of them said, "Oh, we've found a body on the railway line, and we're pretty sure it's Ben." So I had to go and identify it, and that was that.
That must have been pretty bad.
Mm. Yeah, I think that was the worst day of my life.
Now, I suppose, I can look back on Ben's life and I see other schizophrenia sufferers. I could take you in the town now. We could stand outside Marks and Sparks or wherever for 20 minutes, and I think I could point out to you at least a dozen young people that I know who have this illness. And perhaps the general public don't realise they've got this illness. And I look at them and I think, what the hell is there for you in life? Nothing. The state of research at the moment, one hopes, will bring something. We keep hoping and hoping. We must work to make conditions better for these people. We must press governments to make things better for these people, because it's 1% of the population, remember. It happened to us. But then I think Ben, his life, well, he's at peace. That's finished. He at least is out of it. And I'm glad he's out of it. If he couldn't get better, I'm glad he's out of it. It was his wish to be out of it. And if he couldn't get better, and I don't think he could, well, I'm glad he's out of it.
With the help of his sister, Kevin Chesworth is still fighting both the problems of his illness and the realities of community care. To find out how he was coping, we went back to Manchester to see if he had managed to find any of the alternatives suggested by his consultant psychiatrist. Although Kevin has suffered a number of bouts of depression, we met up with him on one of his better days.
I feel quite well for the past 3 days or so. But other than that, at the moment I've got a slight headache. Don't know really why or whatever, just have.
What sort of medication are you on at the moment?
I haven't took any medication for the past 2 days actually.
Don't you know that when you don't do that, you tend to feel not so well? Or...
Yeah, I do actually, but I mean, I don't see any sense in taking it. I mean, I don't really. It doesn't work on me in any case usually. You know, it just makes me worse.
What sort of struggles have you had recently to find somewhere permanent or semi-permanent for Kevin?
Quite a lot of trouble, really. We've been trying to find somewhere where he could stay and have a certain amount of support and still have some money for himself. We've drawn a total blank as to finding somewhere like that. We spent a week where Kevin was sort of going around sleeping in one person's house, another person's house, just anywhere where somebody would let him stay. He still hasn't had any money, which is, I mean, we spent 5 weeks with Kevin sort of going from one point to another point, and we sort of got on the vicious circle where he had no permanent address. So therefore the social security files sort of disappear from one area to another and take weeks to sort things out. He also has no GP at the moment, so therefore he can't get his medication from a GP, so he has to get to the hospital. He has no money for bus fares to get to the hospital, and he has no money to stay anywhere. Last night he slept in, I think, the Salvation Army hostel in Salford.
Do you think you're going to find somewhere to settle and to stay?
I don't know, if we get a flat, you know, somewhere I might be able to, whatever, but I don't think I'll be able to handle it for long unless we've got a certain amount of money to use.
There's a distinct lack of facilities in the community, such as hostel provision or independent living with some outside support. Kevin's social worker has actually told me now that she has exhausted all avenues, so therefore she cannot help anymore.
What did you say to that?
I wish I could give up.
What does the phrase community care mean to you?
I don't know anything about community care, really.
But it's a phrase...
Is that the community nurses, do you mean?
No, I mean, there is a phrase that people talk about, you know, not having people like Kevin in hospital so much, but letting them being cared for by the community. Does it mean anything to you?
No, nobody wants the like of Kevin. Nobody wants him, except his own.
I think if the family, as such, did not help Kevin, he'd be dead. I think it's as simple as that. I mean, it's not an illness that you die from, but the actual symptoms can
make one want to commit suicide.
If your sister wasn't helping you, who do you think would be helping?
Who do you think would be helping me? Either me or just I mean, sometimes I'm so low, you know what I mean, that I can't help myself.
Of the people we've met in this film, Matthew Harvey can perhaps be counted as one of the lucky ones. Provided he takes his medication regularly, his waking nightmares can be kept under control. But he may never be able to work full-time or enjoy that comfortable sense of independence which the rest of us take for granted. The little girl we called Ruth is now a woman of 27. She's also managing to survive, helped by drug treatment and the unstinting support of her parents, whose feelings of helplessness and isolation will never fade. A few years ago, the DHSS refused them an attendance allowance of £12.40p a week. Kevin Chesworth, along with more than 1 million other schizophrenia sufferers and their families, is learning that the policy of community care isn't working. The big mental hospitals are being run down, but virtually nothing is being provided in their place. Ben Hefford killed himself convinced that there was no hope of anybody finding a cure for his illness. With spending on research into schizophrenia running at no more than £500,000 a year, it's difficult to argue with his conclusion. James Andrews and his mother discovered in the hardest possible way that neither we nor our government are prepared to commit adequate resources to those whose lives have been devastated by mental illness. James was killed by our collective indifference and neglect.
I loved him as a person. I had known him for 14 years as a very intelligent, sensitive person with great generosity, a great deal of love for his family. And I knew that someone couldn't change to an entirely different sort of person if there hadn't have been some very major disaster of illness within him. I loved him through everything, and I think that if you love someone and you know they're ill, you can tolerate what has to happen. The great problem is to help them.
Is that one of the things that you found upsetting, that you couldn't help him any more than you did?
Yes, I think that perhaps was the most difficult thing to bear.